From a Hollywood actor's first uncredited bathroom role to the film debut of a future Battlestar Galactica admiral, this cult blaxploitation flick hides secrets more twisted than its production history suggests, including romantic connections that would later intertwine with Beyoncé's family tree. Fact 1. Two movies masquerading as one. Black Fist isn't really one movie at all, but rather two completely separate films that were awkwardly stitched together like some kind of cinematic Frankenstein monster. The bizarre story begins in 1974 when producers shot two different movies back-to-back in Los Angeles. The first film was called Bogart, and the second was titled Get Fisk, both starring Richard Lawson as the same character, but in what were intended to be entirely different stories. Everything went sideways when the original Greek producers of Bogart ran into serious legal trouble. They had been using an illegal tax shelter scheme to finance the film, and when that scheme collapsed, the movie's future looked doomed. The producers, Peter Traynor and William D. Sklar of Centaur Films, lost control of their project when their company went bankrupt, leaving behind a partially completed film and a lot of confused investors. That's when producers William Larrabure and Richard Kay stepped in to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Rather than starting over from scratch, they made a creative decision that would define the movie's strange legacy. They took the existing footage from Bogart, combined it with scenes from the unfinished Get Fisk, and then shot additional connecting sequences to make everything fit together into one coherent story. The result was a movie that constantly shifts in tone and style because it literally contains scenes that were never meant to be in the same film. Characters appear and disappear without explanation. Plot threads start and stop abruptly, and the overall narrative feels disjointed because it actually is. This unusual production method explains why Black Fist has such an odd, patchwork quality that viewers have noticed for decades, though most never knew the real reason behind it. Fact 2. Edward James Olmos' secret film debut. Long before Edward James Olmos became famous as the stoic Admiral Adama in Battlestar Galactica or the tough Lieutenant Castillo in Miami Vice, he made his very first film appearance in Black Fist, playing a character simply credited as Junkie in Bathroom. This tiny, uncredited role marked the humble beginning of what would become one of the most respected careers in science fiction and drama television. The role itself was about as unglamorous as it gets in Hollywood. Olmos appeared in a brief scene set in a bathroom, portraying a drug addict in what was essentially a throwaway moment that most viewers probably missed entirely. There were no lines of memorable dialogue, no dramatic moments, and certainly no hint that this unknown actor would one day become a television icon. The part was so small that Olmos didn't even receive credit for it in the film's official cast listing. What makes this debut even more remarkable is the timing. In 1974, when Black Fist was filmed, Olmos was still a complete unknown in the entertainment industry. He was years away from his breakthrough role in the stage production of Zoot Suit, which would eventually lead to his Tony Award nomination and launch his serious acting career. At the time of filming, he was just another aspiring actor in Los Angeles taking whatever work he could find, even if it meant playing a junkie in a low-budget blaxploitation film. The contrast between this modest beginning and his later achievements is striking. Olmos would go on to earn Emmy and Golden Globe Awards, receive an Academy Award nomination, and become known for portraying complex, dignified characters with gravitas and depth. Yet it all started in a bathroom scene in a movie that most people have never heard of. Fact 3. Philip Michael Thomas's dual identity crisis. Philip Michael Thomas, who would later become famous as Detective Rico Tubbs in Miami Vice, appears in Black Fist playing not one but two completely different characters named Fletch and Boom Boom. This strange situation happened because of the film's unusual production history, where footage from two separate movies was combined into one final product. When Thomas was originally cast in the early 1970s, he was working on what the producers thought would be two distinct films. In the first movie, called Bogart, he played a character named Fletch. Then, when the producers decided to shoot additional footage for what was supposed to be a sequel called Get Fisk, Thomas returned to play an entirely different character called Boom Boom. At the time, these were meant to be separate projects with different storylines and different character relationships. The problem arose when financial troubles forced the producers to abandon their original plan of releasing two separate films. Instead, they took all the footage they had shot for both movies and tried to edit it together into one coherent story. This meant that Thomas's two distinct characters, Fletch and Boom Boom, suddenly had to exist in the same movie universe, even though they were never supposed to meet or interact. The result is deeply confusing for viewers who pay close attention. Thomas appears in scenes playing Fletch, then later shows up playing the completely different character, Boom Boom, with no explanation for why the same actor is playing two different people. The film's credits list both character names, acknowledging this bizarre situation, but the movie itself never addresses the obvious question of why the same person appears to be two different individuals in the same story. Fact 4. The X-rated interracial scandal. When Black Fist was originally completed in 1974 under the title Bogard, the Motion Picture Association of America slapped it with an X rating, not for excessive violence or profanity, but specifically because it contained an interracial sexual scene that censors deemed too controversial for mainstream audiences. This rating decision reflected the social attitudes of the mid-70s, when interracial relationships on screen were still considered taboo enough to warrant the most restrictive rating possible. The X rating created a serious problem for the film's distributors because it severely limited where the movie could be shown and how it could be marketed. Most mainstream theaters refused to show X-rated films, and many newspapers wouldn't run advertisements for them. Faced with the prospect of an extremely limited theatrical release, the producers made a drastic decision to salvage their investment. According to screenwriter Tim Kelly, who wrote about the situation in a letter to the Chicago Reader in 1985, the producers completely removed the interracial sex scene from the film during a re-editing process. This surgical cut allowed them to resubmit the movie to the ratings board, where it received a more commercially viable rating. The re-edited version was then released under the new title, The Black Street Fighter, in 1976. The lost footage has become something of a holy grail for fans of the film. The entire subplot dealing with the interracial relationship was apparently cut out, not just the explicit scene itself. This means that viewers of any current version of Black Fist are missing a significant portion of the original story that the filmmakers intended to tell. The missing scenes help explain some of the choppy editing and confusing plot elements that make the surviving version feel incomplete. Fact 5. Dabney Coleman's racist cop named after beer. Years before Dabney Coleman became famous for playing the sexist boss in 9 to 5, he appeared in Black Fist as a corrupt, racist police officer with one of the most ridiculous character names in film history, Detective Heineken. Yes, the writers actually named a crooked cop after the Dutch beer company, apparently without any concern for how absurd this would sound to audiences. Coleman's character serves as one of the main antagonists in the film, working hand-in-hand with the mob to extort money from the protagonist Leroy Fisk. Detective Heineken demands that Fisk cut him in on his street-fighting earnings, using his police badge as leverage to force compliance. The character represents everything corrupt about law enforcement, taking bribes and protecting criminal enterprises while terrorizing honest citizens. What makes Coleman's role even more memorable is the bizarre way his character meets his end. In the film's climax, Richard Lawson's character takes revenge on the corrupt cop by kidnapping him and dragging him to a meatpacking warehouse. There, Heineken suffers one of cinema's most unusual death scenes when he gets hung on a meat hook in a freezer, where he's left to slowly freeze to death among the hanging beef carcasses. The choice to kill off a character named after a beer brand in a meat locker creates an unintentionally comic moment that viewers often remember long after forgetting other parts of the film. Coleman himself would later acknowledge that this early role helped establish his talent for playing sleazy, corrupt authority figures, a character type that would define much of his later career. The performance showed his ability to make audiences genuinely hate his characters, a skill that would serve him well in bigger Hollywood productions throughout the 1980s. Fact 6. The Motown family connection. Denise Gordy, who played a supporting role in Black Fist, brought serious music industry pedigree to the low-budget production as the niece of Berry Gordy, the legendary founder of Motown Records. Her family connections to one of the most successful record labels in American history added an unexpected layer of glamour to what was otherwise a scrappy independent film made on a shoestring budget. The Motown connection became even more significant when Denise developed a romantic relationship with her co-star Richard Lawson during or after the film's production. The two actors eventually married on New Year's Eve in 1978 and remained together until 1989. Their union created a direct link between the world of blaxploitation cinema and the Motown musical empire that had defined black popular culture throughout the 1960s and 70s. Their daughter, Bianca Lawson, was born in 1979 and would grow up to become a successful actress in her own right, appearing in popular television shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Pretty Little Liars, and Teen Wolf. Through her mother's family connections, Bianca became part of the extended Motown dynasty, linking her to some of the most important figures in American music history. Denise also contributed to Black Fist's soundtrack, recording a song called Let's Do It Again for the film, which allowed her to showcase the musical talents that ran in her family. Her involvement in both the acting and musical aspects of the production demonstrated the kind of multi-talented artistry that was common among Motown-connected performers. The fact that such a prestigious musical family was involved in this obscure blaxploitation film shows how the boundaries between different entertainment industries were more fluid in the 1970s than they would later become. Fact 7. Hard-Boiled Haggerty's wrestling pedigree. The intimidating fighter known as Moose in Black Fist was played by H.B. Haggerty, whose real name was Don Stanzock, and whose life story reads like something out of a sports legend. Before he ever stepped foot on a movie set, Haggerty had already lived through careers as a professional football player and a famous wrestler, making him one of the most genuinely tough guys ever to appear in a blaxploitation film. Haggerty's athletic journey began in the National Football League, where he played as a defensive tackle for both the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers in the early 1950s. After his football career ended, he transitioned into professional wrestling, where he adopted the ring name Hard-Boiled Haggerty and became known for his intimidating presence and heel persona. Wrestling fans of the 50s and 60s knew him as a legitimate tough guy who could back up his on-screen villainy with real physical prowess. His wrestling career spanned about 15 years and took him all across the country, from the American Wrestling Association in the Midwest to various National Wrestling Alliance territories. Haggerty won multiple championships during his time in the ring, including tag team titles, and developed a reputation for being genuinely disliked by crowds because he was so effective at playing the bad guy character. When Haggerty transitioned to acting in the 70s, his imposing physical presence and natural ability to portray menacing characters made him a perfect fit for roles like Moose in Black Fist. His legitimate background as both an NFL player and professional wrestler meant that when he appeared on screen as a dangerous enforcer, audiences could sense that this wasn't just acting but the real deal. Fact 8. The great title, Shuffle Scam. The same basic movie footage has been released under at least 5 completely different titles over the years, creating one of the most confusing identity crises in film history. What started as Bogart in 1974 eventually became Black Fist, the Black Street Fighter, Get Fisk, and Homeboy, with each new title designed to trick audiences into thinking they were watching a brand new movie. This title shuffling began as a survival strategy when the original producers ran into financial and legal problems. Each time the film changed hands or needed to find new distribution channels, the new owners would slap a different title on it and market it as if it were a fresh release. The strategy worked because most moviegoers had no way of knowing that the new action film they were renting at the video store was actually the same movie they might have seen years earlier under a different name. The confusion was made worse by the fact that some versions were edited differently than others, so even people who suspected they were watching the same film couldn't be entirely sure. The Bogart version was longer and more explicit, while the Black Street Fighter cut was edited for a wider audience. Meanwhile, versions released as Homeboy or Get Fisk might emphasize different aspects of the story or use alternate takes of certain scenes. New Line Cinema got in on the action by releasing their own version called The Black Street Fighter, apparently hoping that audiences would confuse it with the popular Sonny Chiba martial arts films. This created yet another layer of mistaken identity, as people looking for authentic Japanese action movies would sometimes end up with this American blaxploitation film instead. The multiple titles allowed distributors to keep selling essentially the same product to unsuspecting customers for decades. Fact 9. Missing reels found in Spain. In February of 2019, independent filmmaker Orlando Eastwood made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the small community of Black Fist enthusiasts when he unearthed reels 4 and 5 of the original Bogart cut on 35mm film. What made this find even more remarkable was that his research revealed these particular reels had apparently only been released on VHS format in Spain, making them incredibly rare pieces of cinema history. Eastwood's discovery was significant because it represented the first concrete evidence that portions of the original uncut Bogart version still existed somewhere in the world. For decades, film historians and fans had assumed that the complete original version was lost forever, existing only in the heavily edited and recut versions that had been circulating since the mid-70s. The Spanish VHS release had somehow preserved footage that had vanished from all other known copies of the film. The find immediately launched Eastwood into an ambitious restoration project, as he began working to locate the missing first 3 reels of the Bogart cut, as well as a complete film print of the Black Fist version. His goal was to eventually produce a definitive Blu-ray release that would finally allow audiences to see the film as it was originally intended, complete with all the controversial content that had been removed over the years. The discovery also raised intriguing questions about how these reels ended up exclusively in Spain and why they had survived when copies in other countries had apparently been destroyed or lost. Eastwood's research into the film's complex distribution history revealed a web of international licensing deals and regional releases that had scattered different versions of the movie across the globe, with some versions surviving in unexpected places. Fact 10. Richard Lawson's double life secret. Richard Lawson knew something that audiences wouldn't discover for years. He was actually starring in 2 completely separate movies at the same time, playing the same character in what were supposed to be entirely different films. During the original 1974 production, Lawson was aware that he was filming scenes for both Bogart and its planned sequel Get Fisk, but he had no idea that these 2 distinct projects would eventually be mashed together into one confusing final product. According to Lawson himself, the producers shot both films simultaneously as part of their original business plan to create a franchise around his character Leroy Fisk. The first movie, Bogart, was meant to establish the character and his world, while Get Fisk was designed to continue his story in a follow-up adventure. Lawson performed different scenes for each project, with different supporting characters, different plot developments, and different emotional arcs for his character. The actor was essentially living a double professional life during production, switching between 2 different versions of the same character depending on which movie the cameras were rolling for on any given day. This required him to keep track of 2 separate storylines, 2 different character relationships, and 2 different sets of motivations for what was essentially the same role. When financial problems derailed the original plan, Lawson watched from the sidelines as producers took his work from both films and edited them together without his input or approval. The final result meant that his carefully crafted performances for 2 different movies were chopped up and reassembled in ways he never intended. Lawson later revealed that seeing the finished product was surreal because he could recognize which scenes came from which original film, even though general audiences had no way of knowing about the bizarre production history. Fact 11. Producer played his own gangster. Charles L. Hamilton wore so many hats during the production of Black Fist that he essentially became a one-man entertainment conglomerate, serving simultaneously as the film's executive producer, the president of Worldwide Pictures Distribution Company, and the actor who played the villainous gangster Ingo. This triple role created one of the most unusual conflicts of interest in film history, as Hamilton was literally paying himself to appear in his own movie. Hamilton's character Ingo serves as one of the main antagonists in the film's final act, portrayed as a wealthy and ruthless crime boss who operates from a luxurious beach house. The role required Hamilton to deliver menacing dialogue and participate in the film's climactic confrontation scenes, all while knowing that he was also responsible for the movie's financing, production decisions, and distribution strategy. The arrangement meant that Hamilton had complete control over how his own character was written, filmed, and edited, which must have been a filmmaker's dream scenario. He could ensure that Ingo got the best dialogue, the most impressive scenes, and the most dramatic moments, since he was making all the creative and business decisions anyway. There was no agent, manager, or studio executive who could interfere with his vision for the character. Hamilton's involvement as both producer and distributor also explains some of the film's complex release history. As president of Worldwide Pictures, he had the authority to make decisions about how the movie would be marketed, which theaters would show it, and how it would be promoted to audiences. This level of control was extremely rare in the film industry, where these roles are typically separated to avoid exactly the kind of conflicts of interest that Hamilton embraced. Fact 12. The Marvin Gaye family scandal. Before Denise Gordy ever appeared in Black Fist, she was already at the center of one of Motown's most complicated family scandals involving legendary singer Marvin Gaye. In 1966, when Denise was just 17 years old, she gave birth to a son named Marvin Gaye III, whose father was the famous musician himself. The situation was made even more shocking by the fact that Marvin Gaye was married to Denise's own aunt, Anna Gordy, at the time. The age difference between the parties involved made the situation particularly scandalous for its era. Denise had turned 16 just 5 days before giving birth, while Marvin Gaye was 26 years old when his son was born. Meanwhile, Anna Gordy was 43 at the time and had been married to Marvin since 1963. This meant that Anna was not only 17 years older than her husband, but also 27 years older than her own niece. The family tried to handle the situation quietly, with Anna even going so far as to pretend she was pregnant when she appeared in public, apparently as a way to cover up the real circumstances of the child's birth. This deception allowed the family to present a united front while dealing with what must have been an incredibly awkward and painful situation behind closed doors. When Denise later married Richard Lawson and had their daughter Bianca, it created an even more complex family tree. Bianca Lawson grew up with Marvin Gaye III as her half-brother, meaning that one of television's most recognizable young actresses is directly connected to both the Motown legacy and one of its most controversial personal stories. The family connections explain why Denise was comfortable enough to contribute vocals to Black Fist's soundtrack, drawing on musical talents that clearly ran in her remarkable family. Fact 13. The Greek tax shelter gone wrong. The original Bogart production was financed through an elaborate Greek tax shelter scheme that ultimately proved to be illegal, creating the financial disaster that would eventually force the film's strange reconstruction. The producers Peter Traynor and William D. Sklar of Centaur Films had arranged what they thought was a legitimate international financing deal. But the complex arrangement fell apart when authorities determined that the tax shelter violated financial regulations. Tax shelter schemes were popular in the 1970s as a way for wealthy investors to reduce their tax burdens while funding entertainment projects. The basic idea was that investors could claim losses on film productions as tax deductions, even if the movies eventually became profitable. Greek tax laws apparently offered particularly attractive opportunities for this kind of arrangement, which is why the Bogart producers looked overseas for their financing. When the scheme was exposed as illegal, it created a cascading series of problems for everyone involved. The Greek investors faced potential legal consequences, while Centaur Films found themselves in bankruptcy proceedings with an unfinished movie and uncertain ownership rights. The collapse happened so quickly that the producers were left scrambling to figure out who actually owned the footage they had already shot and how they could possibly recoup their investments. This financial catastrophe directly led to the bizarre editing choices that would define Black Fist's legacy. When new producers William Larrabure and Richard Kay acquired the rights to the existing footage, they inherited not just a partially completed film, but also a legal mess that required creative solutions. Rather than starting over completely, they decided to salvage what they could from the wreckage by combining the Bogart footage with new material, creating the patchwork final product that audiences would eventually see in theaters. Fact 14. The mysterious screenwriter erasure. When the film was retitled from Bogart to The Black Street Fighter, and eventually to Black Fist, the original screenwriter Mel Frohman suffered one of Hollywood's cruelest fates. His name was completely erased from the credits, effectively wiping his contribution from cinema history. This deliberate removal meant that Frohman lost all official recognition for creating the story, characters, and dialogue that formed the foundation of the film, regardless of how much it was later edited or rearranged. The erasure happened as part of the larger upheaval when Centaur Films went bankrupt and new producers took control of the project. Along with removing the names of original producers Peter Traynor and William D. Sklar, the new ownership apparently decided that acknowledging Frohman's work would somehow complicate their legal ownership of the material. By removing his credit entirely, they could present the film as if it were entirely their own creation. This kind of credit removal was particularly devastating for a working screenwriter like Frohman, whose career depended on building up a filmography that could be used to secure future writing assignments. Without screen credit for his work, he had no way to prove his involvement in the project or use it as a calling card for other potential employers. The film industry operates heavily on credits and references, so losing recognition for a completed screenplay could seriously damage a writer's prospects. The situation only came to light years later, when other screenwriter Tim Kelly wrote a detailed letter to the Chicago Reader in 1985, explaining the complex production history and revealing how Frohman had been written out of the story entirely. Without Kelly's detective work and willingness to speak publicly about the situation, Frohman's contribution might have remained a secret forever, buried under layers of retitling and corporate reorganization. Fact 15. The Street Fighter identity theft. When New Line Cinema decided to re-release the film under the title The Black Street Fighter, they created one of the most misleading movie titles in distribution history, since the film has absolutely no connection to Sonny Chiba's legendary Street Fighter martial arts franchise that was hugely popular at the time. This deliberate confusion meant that fans looking for authentic Japanese action movies would often end up renting or buying an American blaxploitation film instead, leading to decades of mistaken identity and disappointed customers. The original Street Fighter series, starring Sonny Chiba as the brutal martial artist Terry Tsurugi, had become a cult phenomenon in the mid-70s, with films like The Street Fighter and Sister Street Fighter. These movies were known for their intense violence, authentic martial arts choreography, and Chiba's charismatic performance as an anti-hero willing to use any means necessary to win his fights. The series had developed a devoted following among action movie fans who specifically sought out these Japanese imports. New Line's marketing strategy was clearly designed to capitalize on this existing popularity by making their completely unrelated film sound like it belonged to the same franchise. The addition of the word black to the title was presumably meant to suggest that this was some kind of American version or spin-off of the Japanese series, when in reality, it was just a low-budget street fighting movie from Los Angeles with no martial arts pedigree whatsoever. The confusion persisted for years, especially in video stores where both types of films might be shelved together in the action section. Customers expecting to see Sonny Chiba's lightning-fast karate techniques and elaborate fight choreography would instead find themselves watching Richard Lawson's more grounded, realistic street-brawling scenes, creating a jarring disconnect between expectations and reality that probably led to countless frustrated movie nights.